There was a sound that fourth winter that carried a long way across the frozen flat before the light came. And it was not the wind, though the wind was folded into it. And it was not the town's bell 4 miles off, thin and useless in the cold. It was the sound of 9 ponies and the young they had thrown, tearing at a wall of thorn in the dark, cropping and pulling and grinding the frozen haws between their back teeth, working the hedge the way they had worked it every morning for 4 years, patient and endless and sure. The sound of animals eating the one thing the whole county had sworn could not be eaten. And behind that sound, though you would not have heard them because they had learned to be quiet in the presence of a thing they did not understand, stood the people. They stood in the trampled snow at the mouth of the thorn wall where the ponies had worn a road through it wide enough for a wagon, and they stood with their hats in their hands in weather that took the ends off a man's fingers, and they waited. They were the same people who had laughed. They were the storekeeper Voss, who had a frostbitten team dead in his yard and a wife coughing blood into a rag, and they were the Aldous family off the section road with nothing left of their frame house but the stovepipe standing up out of a drift, and they were farmers who 3 winters gone had told each other over the counter that the Renner widow had thrown $200 down a thorn hole and would starve inside a year. They had come to her hill because it was the only warm ground left in that part of the country, and they took their hats off before they went down into it, and not one of them could have told you why. Inside, out of the wind, in a room dug back into the south face of the hill, with walls of stacked stone and packed sod, and a low door a tall man had to stoop through, a young woman sat at a plank table with a lamp and a book, and she was writing down numbers. She was 26 years old. She wore a man's coat and her dead husband's boots stuffed with rag, and she was not writing anything grand. She was writing the morning tally, the count of the ponies, the count of the cords of thornwood cut and stacked, the count of the sacks of ground meal and the jars put by. The same small columns she had kept every day since the day the town laughed. And when she finished a line, she blew on the ink and folded her hands and waited for the next person to come down out of the cold. 75 acres she owned, $200 she had paid for it, 9 ponies she had started with, and no name worth speaking, and no standing, and no man. What none of them standing in that trampled snow understood, not yet, not even after they had gone down into the warm dark and felt the cold stop at the door as though it had been told to stop, was where the warmth came from. They thought it was the hill. They thought it was luck. They thought it was the thorn breaking the wind. And the thorn did break the wind. But the thorn was not the reason, and the hill was not the reason. There was a thing in that hillside older than any of them. A thing that had been waiting under the ground and the sod and the roots of the thorn for 30 years to be found again. And it had been found not by a man with a plan and a survey, but by 9 hungry animals and a woman who counted things. Remember that. Now go back. Go back to the spring 4 years before that killing winter, before the ponies, before the thorn had been worn to a road, back to when the 75 acres was only the worst piece of ground in the county, and everybody knew it and nobody wanted it. And understand first the thing that was hidden in it. Because the thing that was hidden in it is the whole of this story, and it stood at the center of it from the first day to the last, though no living soul knew it was there. Into the south face of that hill, 30 years before Alva Renner ever laid eyes on it, an Englishman named Kell had dug a dwelling. He had come out onto that flat when it was open grass with a wife and 2 children and a wagon and a crate of live cuttings packed in wet sacking, and he had done what a careful man from a green and fenced country does when he is set down in a place with no wood and no stone fence and a wind that comes 400 miles without meeting anything to slow it. He dug himself a house in the ground. He cut into the hillside where the slope would carry the water away, and he faced the cut with field stone laid up dry and true, and he roofed it over with poles and brush and a foot of sod, so that from the flat it looked like nothing at all, like a swelling of the land. And he built a stone chimney into the back of the cut, so the smoke rose out of the hill, as if the hill itself were breathing. It was warm in the worst cold and cool in the worst heat, because the earth around it never let go of an even temper, and it was the safest room in that country, and it saved his family through the first 2 winters when better men in board houses froze. And around his claim, to break the wind that scoured the flat and to fence his ground the only way he knew how to fence, Kell planted the cuttings he had carried across an ocean and half a continent in wet sacking. They were hawthorn, the quickthorn of his home country, the living wall that the men of his people had grown and cut and laid and woven for 1,000 years to hold their sheep and mark their fields. A wall that a man plants once and tends forever, and that will, if he tends it, outlive him and his sons. Kell knew the whole craft of it. He knew that a hawthorn hedge is not left to grow, but is cut back hard, and bent over, and half severed, and pleached down along itself, so that it thickens low, and never runs to trees. And he knew that a beast will browse it, and that the browsing is part of the tending, and he meant to keep his hedge the way his father had kept his father's. But Kell died. The third winter took him, and it took his wife and one of the children, with a fever that came up out of the wet, and the surviving child was carried off to relatives in the east by a neighbor who could not keep her. And the dugout was left with its door swinging, and the hawthorn was left with no hand to cut it. And a hawthorn left with no hand to cut it does not stay a wall. It becomes a country of its own. For 30 years it grew the way it had never been allowed to grow in the old country, up into small hard trees, and out along the ground, where the low branches touched and rooted, and the birds ate the red haws in autumn, and sat in it, and dropped the seed of it in a ring all around themselves, so that every year the thorn threw a new rank of itself out into the grass, and the new rank threw another, until the 75 acres that had been one man's fenced claim was one solid thicket of thorn from edge to edge, higher than a horse in most of it, laced together so tight that a bird could hardly turn inside it, armed the whole length of every branch with spines as long as a man's finger, and hard enough to go through a boot sole. And somewhere in the middle of that thicket, roofed over now with fallen sod and 30 years of leaf, and the roots of the thorn itself grown down through the poles, the dugout waited in the dark, with its dry stone walls still standing true, and its cold hearth still swept, and not one person in the county remembered it was there, or remembered the Kell name, or knew that under the worst ground in the country there was the best room in it. That was the thing that waited. Hold it in your mind. Everything that follows is the slow work of uncovering it. And the woman who uncovered it did not know for one single day of that work that it was there. She came to it the way people come to the bottom of things, which is to say she had run out of everywhere else. Alva Renner had married a man named Cole Renner at 19 and buried him at 22, and what he left her when a green horse rolled on him in a borrowed corral was a debt of $40 at the store, a lease on a shanty she could not pay past the spring, and a string of 9 scrub ponies that no one in the county would buy at any price. Set down her whole estate in a line, and it did not fill a line. She owned 1 iron pot, 1 good dress kept for burying people in, a Bible with the front cover gone, a rifle with a cracked stock she had learned to shoot straight anyway, $40 owed at Voss's store that she paid down $1.50 at a time, and 9 ponies. The ponies were the whole trouble of her life, and the whole of her fortune, and she did not yet know which. They were small and shaggy and hard as boot leather, the kind of half-wild ponies that come up out of hard country and eat what a horse will not eat and stand out in weather a horse will die in. And Cole had won them in a card game and never found a use for them, and neither could anyone else, because they were too small to pull a real plow, and too rough to drive to church, and too clever to keep behind an ordinary fence. Alva could not sell them. She could not eat 9 ponies. She could only keep counting them at dawn, out of a habit she could not name. 9 head against the gray light. And try to think what a person did next when there was no next. The town had already decided about her, and the town had decided the worst way it can decide, which is not with its scorn but with its pity. Scorn a person can set their shoulders against. Scorn is a wind, and you can lean into a wind. But the town did not scorn Alva Renner. It grieved her, out loud, in the aisle of the store and on the church steps. And that is a far harder thing to stand up under than any insult, because it asks you to agree. The kindest of them were the worst. Mrs. Aldous took Alva's 2 hands in both of hers outside the church and told her, with real water standing in her eyes, that there was no shame in going back east to whatever people she had, that a young widow alone on the plains was a sorrow to everyone who watched her, that they had all said among themselves how they did not know how she stood it, and that no one would think the less of her for giving it up. They had decided among themselves. That was the phrase that went around, spoken gently, the way you speak of a sick animal. They had decided among themselves that she would not last, and their kindness was all aimed at helping her agree to it sooner, and Alva Renner stood on the church steps with her chin level, and her 2 hands held in Mrs. Aldous's soft hands, and she said thank you, and she said nothing else, and that was an answer, though no one there could read it. For there was one thing about her that the town could not see and did not count, and it was the only thing about her that mattered, and it is the thing this whole story turns on, So mark it now while it looks like nothing." Alva Renner watched, and she remembered, and she kept the record. Where another person felt, she counted. Where another person argued, she wrote it down and folded the paper and kept it. She had been a watchful child in a house where it paid to see trouble coming, and she had grown into a woman who could not let a fact go past her unmarked. And she kept a book, a plain-ruled tally book, and into it went the count of the ponies, and the price of meal, and the day the rent fell due, and the exact words a man said when he said them, and the date he said them on. It was not a talent anyone praised. It looked like coldness to the warm, and like pride to the proud. But it was the whole of her, and the town, weeping over her on the church steps, weeping with real kindness, never once counted the one thing in her that could not be beaten, because you cannot see a person watching. You can only find out, later, that they were. Now understand the ground itself, because the ground was the problem no one in that county had solved in 30 years, and it had beaten better fixed people than Alva Renner. The Kell place had gone back to the county for taxes long ago, and the county could not give it away. It sat on the tax rolls year after year as delinquent, a 75-acre island of Thorn in the middle of good grass, and the county wanted it off the books and could not manage it, because every conventional way of killing a hawthorn thicket had been tried on it and everyone had failed. Men had tried to burn it, and green hawthorn will not carry a fire in the wet, and where it did dry enough to burn in a bad August, the fire only ran through the tops and left the roots alive underground, and hawthorn burned to the root, comes back from the root, thicker than before, 10 shoots where there was one. Men had tried to grub it out with teams and chain, and the thorns tore the horses until the horses would not face it, and the roots went down past where a chain could hold, and a plow set to it broke its share on the crowns, and the driver went home bleeding. A syndicate out of the county seat, the Standish Land Company, had bought up the paper on it years back thinking to clear it and sell the good soil underneath, and had sent men and money against it for 2 seasons. And the men had quit, and the money had gone, and the Standish Company had done the sum on it, and found that clearing the thorn cost more than the cleared land would ever bring, and had stopped paying the taxes on it, and walked away and let it slide back to delinquent, which is a thing worth remembering. Everybody had done the sum. The sum always came out the same. The land was worth less than the cost of making it worth anything, and so it was worth nothing, and so nobody wanted it. Not the farmers who bordered it and cursed the birds that flew out of it into their crops, not the county that carried it as a dead loss, not the company that had thrown good money into it and learned better. It was the one piece of ground in the country that everyone agreed on. It could not be used and it could not be cleared, and it would sit there in Thorn until the end of the world. And then one spring the county advertised it for tax sale, the way it did every few years, more from duty than from hope, and on the courthouse door for 6 weeks there hung a printed notice that no one troubled to read, and on the day of the sale, a young widow in a man's coat walked into the county building with $9 in coin and a paper from the bank in the town promising the rest, and she stood at the back and listened while the clerk cried the sale. The clerk was Halloran, a soft-handed, careful man who did the county's dull business by the letter and set the clock on every transaction that passed through his hands, and he read the whole of the printed notice aloud before he took a bid, because the law required it, and because Halloran did nothing the law did not require, and nothing it did. He read that the parcel of 75 acres, being the old Kell claim, stood delinquent for taxes, and he read the name of the last owner of record who had let those taxes go, which was the Standish Land Company, and he read that the notice had been posted on the courthouse door for the 6 weeks the law demanded, and he read the sum owed, which was $200 even, and he read the part that Alva Renner wrote down word for word in her tally book while he read it, which was that the sale would pass to the buyer a clean title and would extinguish forever all prior claims, liens, mortgages, and interests of every former owner. Once and only once the redemption period of 2 years had run out with no redemption made. 2 years. He read it plain, and he read the sum plain, $200, and he asked for a bid, and the room, which had come to watch the poor Renner widow more than to buy anything, went quiet in the way a room goes quiet before it laughs. She bid the $200. She bid the whole amount owed, flat, the only bid, in a plain, steady voice she had spent 3 years learning to keep level, and Halloran, who had expected to close the sale unsold as he had closed it unsold 3 times before, looked up over his spectacles and asked her twice was she certain, and she said she was, And he wrote it down, and the room laughed. It was not cruel laughter to their own minds. To their own minds, it was the laughter of grief let out sideways. The laughter of people who could not bear to watch a foolish thing done by someone they pitied, and had to make a joke of it to stand it. Voss the storekeeper said out loud that he'd give her $200 worth of thorns off his own north line for nothing, and save her the walk. And the room laughed harder, and Mrs. Aldous by the door did not laugh but pressed her handkerchief to her mouth as if she were watching a burial, which to her mind she was. Alva Renner folded the receipt Halloran gave her along one crease, the way a person folds a thing they mean to keep, and put it inside her coat against her chest, and picked up the copy of the printed notice off the courthouse door on her way out, because it had her land's name on it, and folded that too, and walked out into the street with her chin level, and did not look at one face, and the laughter followed her out the door and down the steps, and she let it, and gave it nothing back. Not that day, nor any day. She was standing at the rail tying her mule when the old man spoke to her, and his was the first voice in 3 years that had not pitied her or mocked her. And because it was the first, she remembered every word of it and kept it the way she kept the receipt. He was an old Welshman named Owen Price, who lived alone on a poor scrap of thorn ground at the far edge of the county, with a few hardy ponies and a reputation for keeping to himself, a man the town regarded, when it regarded him at all, as a foreigner who had never learned to want the things a man ought to want. He had watched the whole of it from the shade of the building, and he came over slow, and he did not say she had done a foolish thing, and he did not say she had done a wise one. He put out his hand and laid the flat of his palm against a branch of hawthorn that grew up wild along the courthouse fence, laid it flat, and careful the way you lay your hand on the flank of an animal that might startle. And he did not pull it back, though the thorns pressed white into his skin. And he looked at her, and he said the thing that she would carry for the rest of her life, and would say herself, word for word, an old woman at the end of it, with her own palm flat against the thorn. Thorn keeps what it hides, girl. Set a patient beast to it, and in its own time it gives you back the door. Then he took his hand off the thorn, with the small red marks standing up on his palm, and he told her only one thing more, which was that his people had lived 1,000 years off ground the like of hers, and that the ponies she could not sell were worth more than the men who had laughed at her. And then he went to his own mule and rode off toward the edge of the county and left her holding the whole of it, the receipt and the notice and the proverb, folded together against her chest. She did not understand the proverb the day he said it, and she did not need to. She only kept it, the way she kept everything. But she understood the ponies, or came to, standing at the edge of her 75 acres of thorn in the weeks after, with the deed in her coat, and no earthly notion of what to do with a wall of spines taller than a horse, and the understanding when it came, did not come as a plan, but as a thing she noticed, because noticing was what she did. She turned the 9 ponies into the thorn because she had nowhere else to keep them, and no feed to buy, and nothing to lose, and she watched them, and what she watched was this. The ponies were not afraid of the thorn the way a horse is afraid of it. They put their heads down, and their tough lips out, and they browsed it. They stripped the tender leaf and the new bud and the green tip off the ends of it, working along a branch and leaving the bare wood, and they cracked the red haws between their back teeth and ate the fruit and the seed of it. And where a branch hung low, they broke it down and stood on it and ate the length of it. And they pushed their thick-coated bodies into the thicket after the green and made themselves narrow trails. And they came out the far side with their winter coats full of broke-off spines and no marks on the hide underneath, because the coat was armor enough, and they went in again the next day. They ate the thorn. The one thing that 30 years of men with fire and chain and teams had not been able to defeat. 9 unsellable ponies did every single day, for the plain reason that they were hungry, and the thorn was food. And once she had seen it, she could not stop seeing what it meant, because she was a woman who followed a fact all the way down. If the ponies ate the new green off the thorn, then the thorn could not thicken, because a hawthorn thickens from its new green. If the ponies ate the haws, then the thorn could not seed itself out into the grass, because the seed was in the haws, and the seed went down the ponies and came out spent. If the ponies wore trails through it and stood on the low branches and broke them down and dunged the trails as they went, then every trail was a strip of the thicket turned slowly to bare ground, and then to manured ground, and then, the following spring, to a ribbon of grass. And if she kept the ponies to that work season on season, and let their numbers grow, and cut the biggest woody stems herself in the dead of winter, when nothing else could be done, laying them down along the trails the way the old man's hand had shown her to think of it, then the thorn would not be burned and would not be grubbed and would not be beaten in a day, but it would be eaten, from the inside, a mouthful at a time, by animals that would do the work for the price of their own hunger, and throw more of themselves every spring to do more of it. It was slow. It was the slowest thing anyone had ever set out to do in that county. It would take years, and she knew it would take years the day she understood it. And years were the one thing she had, because she was 22 and alone and going nowhere, and a person going nowhere has all the time in the world to arrive. So she began, and the years went the way the years go, measured not in months, but in what the thorn gave back. The first summer, the 9 ponies opened 3 trails, and she cut a winter's worth of thornwood from the big stems, and burned it in a stove she set up in the shanty, and no one saw any change at all, and the town's pity settled into a kind of forgetting, which was worse, because to be pitied is at least to be seen. The second summer the 9 ponies were 12, and the trails they had opened the first year came up in grass that they grazed and dunged and widened, and the thicket, cut and browsed and unfed by its own seed, stopped throwing new rank out into the grass for the first time in 30 years, and along the whole south edge it began, very slightly, to shrink, though no one but Alva measured it, pacing it out along the same line every autumn and writing the paces in the book. By the second autumn she had moved out of the shanty she could not pay for, and into the thorn itself, into a lean-to of cut thornwood banked with sod against the weather, because it was warmer in the lee of that great wall than anywhere on the open flat, and she had noticed that too, that the thorn broke the wind so complete that the snow did not drift against its south face, but was carried on past to bury other people's fences, and she wrote that down as well, not knowing yet what it was worth, only that it was true. The third summer the ponies were 15, and they had eaten a full third of the 75 acres down to grass and stubble of thorn, and men driving the section road slowed their teams to look at the strange half-cleared country where a thicket had been, and did not understand it, and drove on. 15 head where there had been 9, a third of it open where all of it had been shut, 3 years gone. She was 25 and she had not left, and the town had run out of ways to grieve her and had begun, without admitting it, to watch. Somewhere in the 3rd year the boy came to her, and because this story keeps all its accounts, I will tell you now where he came from and not lose him. He was called Wick, and he was 9 or 10 years old and nobody's, the last of a family that had tried to make a living 2 counties west on a claim as thorn-choked and poor as hers had been, and had failed at it, and had died of the failing, the father first of a lung sickness, and the mother after of the same, and of not much wanting to go on. And the county had passed the boy along the roads, the way counties passed orphans then, from a hand that could not keep him, to a hand that could not keep him, until he fetched up at Alva Renner's thorn wall one evening, with his feet wrapped in flour sacking, and nothing in him but the habit of going on. She took him in without any words about it. She was raising ponies out of thorn, and she raised the boy the same way, by feeding him and setting him to watch and letting the slow work make him. She gave him the tally book to keep the pony count in, and he kept it, grave beyond his years the way children got who had watched their people die of the plains, and he learned to read the thorn and the weather off her, and to lay a cut stem down along a trail, and to count 19 head at dawn against the gray, and he did not smile much, and he did not need to, and the record of that place, which had been one woman's habit, became a thing with a second keeper who would outlive her. Mark him. The knowledge did not die with her because of him, but that is the end of his account, and we are not there yet. The first thing that could not be argued with came up out of the ground in the 4th spring, and it came up in the sheltered elbow of the hill where the ponies had always gone hardest at the work, because that was the warm corner out of the north wind where they crowded to browse and to stand out the cold nights, and 4 years of 19 hungry animals, crowding that one corner had done to it what no one had set them to do. They had worn it down. They had eaten the thorn off it and trampled the roots of the thorn out of it, and worn the very ground of it down with their feet and their standing and their dunging, foot by foot, season by season, until one morning Wick came to the table with the tally book and told her, flat, that there was stone in the hillside where there had not used to be stone. She went and looked. In the worn elbow of the hill, where the ponies had scraped and browsed the sod off the slope, a course of dry-laid field stones stood out of the dirt, straight and true and mortarless, laid by a hand and not by any accident of the land, and above it, where the animals had worn the drifted sod down off the top of the slope, the mouth of a stone chimney showed, and lower down, half choked still with root and dirt, the square head of a doorway with a stone lintel across it. The ponies had worn the hill down to a door. 30 years the dugout had waited under the thorn, and 9 ponies and the 10 they threw had found it, not by digging for it, because none of them knew it was there, but by sheltering against the one warm hillside in that country winter after winter, until they wore the cover off the warmest room a man ever built in it. She stood a long time in front of it in the cold spring wind, and she did not say anything, and then she got a spade, and the boy got the other one, and they began to clear the doorway, and behind the dirt and the roots, the low door swung inward on the dark, and inside, dry and even-tempered and swept smooth by 30 years of nothing, was the room Kell had built, the stone walls standing, the hearth clean, the earth around it holding its patient heat, waiting. She moved into it before the month was out. She had bought 75 acres of Thorn for $200 and been laughed out of the county building for it, and the Thorn had been keeping a house for her the whole time. And that was the spring the smooth man came, because value had appeared at last, and the smooth man never comes before there is value, and once there is value he comes without fail, as regular as the birds to the haws. His name was Merritt, and he came out from the county seat in a gray suit and a buggy behind a matched team. A well-spoken, well-fed man with clean, soft hands and a leather case of papers, the agent now for the Standish Land Company, the same syndicate that years before had bought the paper on the Kell place, thrown 2 seasons of money at the Thorn, done the sum, and let the taxes lapse and walked away. He did not come the way the county had feared she was, in poverty and defeat. He came in kindness, all of it, from the first word. He was sorry to trouble a hard-working young widow, he said, and he could see she had done wonders, real wonders, with a hopeless piece of ground, and it grieved him to be the bearer of a complication, but he had a duty to his principles, and she seemed a sensible woman who would rather hear a hard thing plain. The Standish Company, he explained, holding his soft hands open as though the papers pained him, had never fully surrendered its interest in the parcel. There had been an irregularity in the old tax proceeding. There were prior liens that a tax sale of that kind did not always clear, whatever a country clerk might have said at the time, and these things, if they went to law, could ruin a person of small means, could drag through the courts for years and eat up everything she had built and the land with it, and no one wanted that, he least of all. And so, out of a wish to do right by her and to spare her the whole miserable business, the company was prepared to be generous. He named a figure, $2,000, cash, for a quit of her claim, 10 times what she had paid, more money than she had ever seen or would ever see again, and she could walk away whole and comfortable, and let the company take up the burden of the land and its title troubles, and there was no shame in it, none at all, only good sense, and he smiled at her the whole gentle way through it, with real regret in his face, because a man like Merritt believes his own kindness while he is robbing you, and that is what makes him dangerous, and that is also, in the end, what undoes him, because a man that in love with the sound of his own decency does not know when to stop talking. He talked too long. That was his whole flaw, and it was a fatal one, and it came out of him in the middle of all that gentle regret. One sentence too many, the sentence that gave him away, and she caught it because catching things was the one thing she had always done. He was pressing the $2,000 on her, warning her again of the ruin she was courting, and to show her he understood the place and its true worth better than she did, to show her he was dealing fairly with her about a valuable thing and not cheating her over a thornbrake. He let it fall that the company had always known there was the old sod dwelling built back into the South Hill, the stone house in the bank, and that a property with a sound dry dwelling already on it was worth protecting a claim over, and he smiled, pleased with his own frankness. And then he stopped, because he had felt the air change, and Alva Renner was looking at him the way she had looked at the ponies the first day, seeing a fact and following it all the way down. The company had always known the dugout was there. They had known there was a house in the hill. They had known it when they threw their money at the Thorn, and known it when they did the sum, and known it when they let the taxes lapse and walked away, and they had let the whole of it go, house and hill and 75 acres, because to their sum a house they could not reach through a wall of thorn was worth nothing, and a piece of ground that cost more to clear than it would sell for was worth less than nothing, and they had thrown it away with their eyes open. It had never been worthless. They had known that. They had only judged it not worth the patience. And a thing a man throws away knowing what it is he cannot come back and take once another person has spent 4 years and their whole life proving him wrong about the patience. She did not say any of that to him. She had learned long ago that the fewer words you spend, the harder the ones you keep. She got up from the plank table, and she went to the shelf where the tally book sat, and beside it, the folded papers she had kept for 4 years against her chest, and then in a tin. And she took out 2 of them, the receipt Halloran had given her, folded along its one crease, and the copy of the printed notice she had lifted off the courthouse door the day of the sale. And she unfolded the notice and laid it flat on the table in front of Merritt and his leather case. And she put one finger on the line she had once written down, word for word, while Halloran read it aloud. The line that named the last delinquent owner of record as the Standish Land Company, and the line below it that said, "The sale extinguished forever, all prior claims and liens and interests of every former owner, once the redemption period of 2 years had run with no redemption made." 2 years. She said 4 words to him, and they were the shortest things said in that room by anyone the whole afternoon, and they were the only thing that needed saying. You let it go. The 2 years had run out a full year past. The company that Merritt spoke for was not some stranger, with a prior claim the country clerk had overlooked. The company that Merritt spoke for was the very name printed on the notice as the owner who had defaulted, the owner whose every claim and lien and interest the sale had wiped away by its own printed terms once the redemption window closed. And the redemption window had closed a year before Merritt ever drove out in his gray suit, and there was nothing in his leather case that could reach back across a thing his own principals had forfeited by walking away from it with their eyes open. The fact had been read aloud in a quiet county room 4 years before, and one person in that room had written it down and folded it and kept it, and now it lay flat on a plank table under her finger, and it beat him. He tried the length of his talk against it for a while, because talking was all he had, and the more he talked, the smaller he got, and at last he understood that the woman across the table had not raised her voice once, and was not going to, and had a paper that said in the county's own words what he had come to pretend was not so, and that she had known it before he finished his first kind sentence. He gathered his papers back into the case with hands that were not quite so soft-looking as before, and he wished her well in a voice gone flat, and he drove his match team back out the section road toward the county seat, and he did not come again. And within the season the word was that Merritt had left that part of the country for another, quietly, the way that kind always leaves, and the Standish name went off the story for good. Then came the winter that flipped the whole county over, the winter this story opened in, and it did not come as a reward, and the plains do not hand out rewards. It came as a killing. It came down out of the north in the 4th winter, after the sale in a blizzard, that men who lived through it spoke of for the rest of their lives in a lowered voice. 3 days of wind out of the north, with the temperature dropping past anything the thermometers there could measure, and the snow driving level and fine as ground glass, so that a man could not see the far side of his own team. And it fell on a county of people who had built the way people built on the open plains, in board houses set up proud on the flat, with the wind able to get at them from every side, and a fence line of posts and wire that stopped nothing. It took them the way the first hard winters had taken Kell's neighbors 30 years before, and for the same reason, because they had built against the plains instead of into it. Frame houses stood open to a wind that pulled the heat out of them faster than any stove could put it back, and the stock died in the fence corners where the drift buried them, and the Aldous house on the section road came apart in the second night, and the family walked out into the storm, because staying was death and nearly found death in the walking, and Voss the storekeeper's fine team froze standing in his yard. The conventional homesteads, the sensible ones, the ones built the way a reasonable person builds, could not stand against it, and had never been able to, and everyone had always known winters like it came, and had built wrong anyway, because building right looked poor, and looked foreign, and looked like a house dug in the ground, with thorns grown up around it. And it could not touch her. That is the whole of it, and it is why they came with their hats in their hands. The blizzard came down out of the north, and hit the great wall of hawthorn that ringed the 75 acres, the wall 30 years grown and 4 years browsed down to a low, thick hedge along the north line, and the wall broke the wind the way it had always broken the wind, and carried the driving snow up and over and past to bury other people's fences, so that the ground in the lee of it lay almost bare, and the animals stood out of the worst of it in the trails they had eaten, shaggy and thick-coated and bred out of hard country to stand exactly this. And back in the south face of the hill, dug into the earth that held its patient even temper against any cold the sky could pour down, behind a stone wall Kel had laid true 30 years before, and a low door and a foot of sod. The dugout stayed warm on a single stove, warm as spring, the safest room in the county now, as it had been the safest room in the county the day it was built. Because the earth does not care what the wind is doing, and never has. Alva Renner and the boy Wick sat out 3 days of the worst weather in the history of that country in a warm room in the ground and lost not one animal and not 1 hour of sleep to fear. And when the wind fell on the 4th morning and the sun came up on a wrecked and frozen county, the word of where the warm ground was went out across the flat the way word goes, and they came. They came because there was nowhere else, and she let them in, and here is the part that is the true center of it, more than the thorn and more than the dugout, because anyone can be saved by luck, and the plains hand out no rewards, but they do hand out chances to show what a person is made of. She did not give it away. She was no fool and had never been one, and the whole town's long pity had been the pity of fools for someone wiser than themselves. She had thorn wood cut and stacked by the cord, 4 winters of it, and ground meal in sacks and jars put by, and shelter in the lean-tos in the lee of the hedge, and she had it because she had counted and cut and stored against exactly the day nobody else believed would come, and she set a price on it. She set a fair price, not a low one, because a low price is another kind of lie, and it teaches people that what saves them is worth nothing, and not a high one, because gouging a freezing neighbor is the smooth man's trade, and she had just run the smooth man out of the county. A fair price, the true worth of a cord of wood and a sack of meal and a dry, warm night to a person who would otherwise die without them, and to those who came with empty hands, the Aldous family with their house gone, and Voss with his team dead and his wife coughing, she gave the wood and the meal and the shelter against their word, on a handshake, to be paid back in work or in coin when the spring came and the world started up again, a debt written into the tally book in her plain hand with the date beside it, because she kept the record of what she gave the same as she kept the record of everything, not to hold it over them, but because a thing done ought to be true and written true. That was the win. Not the $200 grown into a whole valley of good grass, not the $2,000 she had refused, not the town brought low and needing her. The win was a fair price, and a handshake and a line in the book, and it was hers because she had been made, by 4 years of thorn and 9 ponies and a hard, slow patience, into a person large enough to set it. And so we are back where we began, at 4 o'clock on the frozen mornings of that 4th winter, with the sound of the ponies tearing at the thorn in the dark, and the people standing in the trampled snow at the mouth of the hedge with their hats in their hands. And now you know what they had not known, and what the story held back from you, the way it held it back from them. You know that the warm ground was a house a dead Englishman built into a hill 30 years gone, and that 9 unsellable ponies wore the hill down to its door without one of them knowing it was there. You know that the wall of thorn everyone had laughed at was the only thing between that county and the wind. You know that the $200 they had laughed her out of the county building for was the best $200 anyone in that country ever spent, and that the 75 acres of worthless thornbrake had been keeping, the whole time, under its spines, in the dark, the one thing that could not be bought, and had been thrown away by men who knew exactly what it was and would not wait for it. And you know why the same people who had grieved her on the church steps and made a joke of her in the store took their hats off before they went down out of the cold. And it was not because she had beaten them, because she never once said a word of triumph, not that day nor any day, but because a person cannot stand at the door of a thing they mocked and be saved by it and keep their hat on their head. There is no name for what they felt, and I will not put one on it. They took their hats off. That is the whole of it. The years after went the way the good long years go, quietly. And this story keeps its accounts, so hear the last of them, and then we are done. The old Welshman Owen Price, who had given her the only words in 3 years that were neither pity nor scorn, and who lived out at the poor edge of the county on his scrap of thorn, she did not forget, and when he grew too old to keep himself, she brought him in and gave him a warm room, and the run of the ponies he had told her were worth more than the men who laughed. And he lived out his last years in comfort, watching the thing his one true sentence had set in motion, and he died content and full of years in the warm, which is the reward such men are owed and so seldom given. The boy Wick grew up tall on that ground and never left it, and the tally book passed fully into his hands, and he ran the ponies and laid the hedge and kept the record after her the way she had kept it, and married in time and raised his own on the green that had been Thorn, so that the knowledge did not die when she died but went on, which was the whole point of him from the evening he came out of the roads with his feet in flour sacking. Voss paid his debt in the spring and never quite met her eye again, and was decent to her forever after, in the awkward way of a man who owes his life to someone he once mocked. Mrs. Aldous, who had wept over her on the church steps and told her gently to give it up, lived long enough to bring her own granddaughter out to that hill to see the woman who had done the thing the whole county said could not be done, and told the child the story with the pity all worn off it and something better in its place. And Alva Renner grew old on her 75 acres, on grass that had been Thorn, over a warm house in the ground that 9 ponies found for her, rich in the only ways she had ever counted rich, in stock and in stores, and in the true worth of a thing patiently made, and she never gloated and never went back east, and never took her hat, when she wore one, off to anybody, and she stayed to the end of her long life the same watchful woman who counted the ponies against the gray light at dawn, out of a habit she could not have named. And at the very end of it, an old woman, now with her hair gone white and her hands gone to knots, she was standing one spring morning at the edge of her ground, where a low, thick hedge of hawthorn ran along the north line, and there came out from the county a young woman she had never seen, thin and alone and set-jawed and poor, a young widow or a runaway or an orphan the way she herself had once been thin and alone and set-jawed and poor, who had heard there was a woman out this way who had made something out of Thorn, and who had it in her mind to buy a worthless piece of the same and try. And Alva Renner looked at her a long moment and saw the whole of her own young self standing there with nothing, and no name, and no standing, and no man, and she did not tell her it would be hard, because the girl knew it would be hard, and she did not tell her the town would pity her, because the girl would learn that. She reached out one old knotted hand and laid the flat of her palm against the thorn along the north line, laid it flat and careful the way you lay your hand on the flank of an animal that might startle, the way an old Welshman had laid his hand on a branch by a courthouse fence a lifetime before, and she did not pull it back though the thorns pressed white into her old skin, and she gave the girl the one true sentence the way it had been given to her, word for word, the same words with the same hand. Thorn keeps what it hides, girl. Set a patient beast to it, and in its own time it gives you back the door. And out beyond the two of them, down the long green slope that had been a wall of spines, the ponies were at the hedge in the morning, the way they were every morning, and would be every morning after the old woman was gone, tearing and cropping and grinding the thorn between their teeth, patient and endless and sure, and the sound of it went on and on after her voice had stopped, the low, steady sound of the worthless thing being turned, a mouthful at a time, into everything, going on across the grass and into the wind, and past the last word of it, on and on and on.